It's September 22nd, 2024. Welcome to Nation Watch. From wherever you're joining us, welcome to Nation Watch. I'm your host, Mervyn Williams. Nation Watch is a production of the People's National Congress Reform, and we're coming to you live from Congress Place. Sophia, we apologize for the late start today, which was due to some technical difficulties. Before we get into our program today, there is a small matter I'd like to address. But just so that you know, today's program will focus on the official list of electors. I gave you some notes last week. You can pull them up, and we'll be going into our conversation on those numbers I supplied you with last week. I'm sure you took notes. But there's this small issue. There's a community in the West Demerara called Haigback Dam, as we know it. The community's primary economic activity is rice farming. And there's a project that has been recently undertaken in that community that is causing some unease with the residents there. Now, it's harvest time in the rice industry at Haigback, and we're going to show you how the rice fields look at the moment. It's harvest time. Rice is ready to be cut and transported to the mills. And there's a bridge that is under construction. The residents in general, and the rice farmers in particular, feel very uncomfortable that the contractor or his or its principals did not see it fit to engage the residents of Haigback regarding the timing of the commencement of the construction of this bridge, which was roadworthy at the time. It was useful. It was vehicles were able to traverse with ease, heavy vehicles at that. So there's this detour bridge now that you're seeing, which looks very flimsy, and people are nervous about it. But rice transport tractors will have to cross that bridge if the rice farmers are to get to the mill. And the average weight in one of those trailers is about 23,000 pounds, roughly about 23,000 pounds, 150 bags by an average of 150 pounds per bag, equivalent, sometimes even more. So the question on the minds of the farmers of Haigback is, how do they get their paddy to the mill? Can they actually realize the profits that they envisaged they will make, apart from the rainfall and the water accumulation in the land, which is causing some problems in harvesting, causing some farmers to actually lose crop? Here is a situation where even more hardship is brought upon the people. They have no objections to improvements, bridge reconstruction, whatever it would be, but they are seriously concerned about the fact that they were not consulted with, and the bridge replacement goes on at a time when they require the use of that bridge even more than any other time in the year. So for the attention of the Minister of Agriculture, I know, sir, that you're under tremendous pressure right now with all the allegations floating around in that ministry, at the various agencies within the ministry. I know you're under pressure. And with all the beef coming from Brazil, which may not be compliant with import license and food safety regulations, just take some time out and pay attention to the rice farmers at Haigback. Right, so today we'll be talking about the official list of electors, and my guest is the longest serving commissioner at the Guyana Elections Commission, Mr. Vincent Alexander, AA. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the program, bringing the kind of perspective and the facts that you bring, supporting the perspectives that you present here. Mr. Alexander, the last census report available to the Guyanese public, maybe not even totally, but at least in parts, was the census of 2012. The most recent census conducted was about 2 years ago, and the report has not yet been released for one reason or the other. But if we were to look at the population reported in the 2012 census, that number, ladies and gentlemen, you have it, referred to it as 746,955. That was the population size reported. Now we have the official list of electors produced and presented by the Guyana Elections Commission. It was published, I believe, on the 2nd of September 2024. It is valid up to the 31st of December 2024. And that official list of electors tell us that there is, let me say this slowly. The official list of electors produced by the Guyana Elections Commission on the 2nd of September 2024 tells us that there are 718,715 eligible voters. That, Mr. Alexander, is 96.2% of the 2012 population. That's the last updated population census that we have. So the OLE, the official list of electors, is 718,715. The census population is 746,955. The OLE is 96.22% of the population. Mr. Alexander, what's happening here with these numbers?
Well, what has occurred has been predicted. We have predicted that given the fact that we are not in a position to renew the register of registrants from which the voters list is drawn, that the time will come when the voters list will probably exceed the census population. And we are getting there quickly. And this has to do with the fact that there are large numbers of persons who are on that list who are resident overseas. But of greater concern is that of the number resident overseas between 2008 and present, tens of thousands would have died, and they're still on the list. So I think the major part of the problem we're faced with is the overseas Guyanese who are on the list, and more specifically, that among those, large numbers would have been deceased, and there is no mechanism to take them off of the list. So even if one were to comply with the contention that any living Guyanese has a right to be in the list, there has been no attention to the fact that no dead person should be in the list, given the number of dead persons overseas who continue to be on our list. Now, in normal circumstances, one may say, so what's the problem? Because we have an electoral system where there are all sorts of mechanisms to ensure that there are no imposters, there's no fraudulent voting. And that's what is mooted locally and even mooted overseas. But the fact of the matter is that we have to admit and accept that there is sufficient evidence coming out of the 2020 elections to show that the systems have not worked, and to show that persons who were not entitled to vote because they were not present in the country did in fact vote. This is a matter of fact. And this nation seems to want to cast aside and ignore this fact. The fact of the matter is, in the 2020 elections, during the course of the recount, the APNU AFC threw up a number of names questioning the legitimacy of those votes. This led to them making submissions to GECOM of those names. The GECOM, as a consequence of those submissions, sent two of the lists to the chief immigration officer, who responded verifying that on each of those lists, at least 75% of the persons were not present in Guyana, and therefore their votes could not be considered to be eligible votes. That is something no one has been able to refute, no one has attempted to refute, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, this is a factual situation coming through a process where on one hand, the APNU AFC identified during the recount, based on the documentation available, that there were votes cast for certain persons, questioned whether those persons were in the country, had the relevant authority through GECOM, because it's GECOM that sent the list to the relevant authority, determined that 75% of those persons were not in the country, but votes were cast for them. And so this is the evidence of what could occur in the future and what has occurred in the past of persons who are not in the country being able to vote. And even worse is that a large number of those persons are not even live persons. They're persons who have died overseas. And absolutely no effort has been made to deal with this problem. We have a government that contended that there were issues at the last elections. And as a consequence of the issues of the last elections, they had a consultation in relation to the RUPA, Representation of the People's Act, and the National Registration Act. And as a consequence of those consultations that they said they had, and I don't consider them to have been proper consultations, I'll say more about that later, they made amendments to RUPA and amendments to the National Registration Act. But absolutely no attention has been paid to the real issue for which there is evidence. To compound that, GECOM refused to do a review of the last elections so that they could understand where there were flaws in the system that could be addressed. And so GECOM itself has not addressed evident flaws in the system.
And this is at the level of the commission?
At the level of the commission. And the most evident flaw in the system is that people who were not entitled to vote had votes registered for them. Now, the response of the People's Progressive Party is that there are 2 or 3 persons who came out and said, my name is on that list, but I'm alive, I'm present. What the report from the immigration officer showed, that indeed, of the list submitted by APNU AFC, 75% were not in the country. Mm-hmm. So you can find 1 and 2.
Yes.
And that is no evidence to say that there wasn't instances when what the immigration officer has said is that 75%. I think in one instance where there are 311 persons listed, 290 something of them, or 79 of them, were considered not to have been in the country.
This is explainable. This is clearly understood. But how does GECOM, how does the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission in particular explain to this nation that the difference between the official list of electors and the population of this country is 28,240 people, when there is a school population of in excess of 250,000? How does the chairman, I know you can't speak for the chairman, but how is this explained to the citizens of this country?
Well, you said I can't speak for the chairman. The fact of the matter is the chairman hardly speaks for herself. We do not have a chairman of the Elections Commission who routinely addresses the press and exposes herself to answering questions about the conduct of the affairs of GECOM. It's all hush-hush. What we have from time to time is the governing party, through their representatives, issuing statements and making statements, but GECOM itself does not come forth to address this matter, because what she would be asked to address in the first instance is how could she justify after an election that was highly controversial,
No
a
review.
refusal to do an internal review of GECOM's systems when there were so many things to be reviewed. I have mentioned one thing which should be reviewed, and that is the whole question of what are the possibilities of individuals who are not in the country voting. And the question is not just what are the possibilities, it's how did it occur? How do we review and see how it occurred and how we can stop that? But we also have the situation on the East Coast where over 11,000 votes
Or unverified.
were unverified in the recount process. And again, here is where GECOM should be doing a review to understand how is it that the documentation which is required to be submitted by the election officials cannot be located for the purpose of verification. And so there are serious issues that have not been addressed, but yet we have had a so-called reform of the legislation.
Which is what I want to come
that
to.
was intended or said to be intended to address the electoral system.
The new Section 8, that's 8, big A, big B, and big C, as they would refer to it, makes some interesting provisions. I rather suspect that some of these provisions would have already been there, but in perhaps not as strongly worded as these new inserts. 8A says that the Registrar General of Births and Deaths, appointed under the Registration of Births and Deaths Act, shall send to the Commissioner once every month a list of all persons 14 years and more whose deaths have been registered under the Registration of Births and Deaths Act in the preceding month, and that the Commissioner shall cancel the registration of any such persons from the central and divisional registers whose name is on the list of dead persons sent by the Registrar General to the Commissioner.
Could we take them one at a time?
Under one, yes.
Could we take them one at a time?
Now, the question here for me is, does GECOM routinely comply with this prescription?
GECOM receives periodically, cannot say it's once per month, the list of the registered dead, and we do flag those names in the register of registrants. So that's not an issue, and that's not anything new.
Right.
It is ongoing. What is in relation to that provision, the problem would be that not all deaths are registered. There are local deaths which are not registered, and we saw in the past problems with President Arthur Chung, Viola Burnham, that they died and their names continue to be on the list. We saw that. So we know there's a flaw in terms of that. But let me go back to what I said earlier. That does not cater for the tens of thousands of Guyanese who die overseas. So that does not solve our problem. It is a mechanism that does allow for local people who died to be taken off of the list, but it does not address the magnitude of the problem.
Is it complied with routinely? Does it work? Because I'll tell you what, past experiences have shown in the objection side of the operations of the People's National Congress at these registration processes, that persons are known to be dead in certain registration districts. I live next to somebody who died, for example, and representation is made at the level of the commission in the period of objections. But the response is that you require an official death certificate as the instrument that is officially used for the removal of that name on the basis of death. Now, if my neighbor is PPP and I am PNC and I object, it is not in the interest of my PPP neighbor to produce a death certificate to have that person's name removed. And I am not authorized to go to the Central Registrar's office and obtain a death certificate for somebody who is in no way connected to me. So that dead person's name remains on that list. Is there a solution to problems such as these?
Now, first of all, let me repeat. Though someone may die, and that person may have a death certificate, that does not mean that the death has, in fact, been registered with the Register of Births and Deaths. You can have a death certificate that originates from the medical process, the health system. But there's another process that requires an actual registration of that death. And so you may have people who have died and their names are not off because there was no registration, so to speak, of their death. And so the registrar cannot send us those names. Now, the question that arises here is our system for claims and objections. You have made the point that you make an objection because you know the person has died. And the response of GECOM, based on the system we have, is where's the death certificate? And if there's no death certificate, then they do not entertain the objection. Now here we have a situation where in this country, we are now granting birth certificates based on an affidavit of a Tushau or some leader in the community. We're granting birth certificates. But we refuse to take an affidavit from someone who says, my father has died. And so the system is obviously skewed not to deal with the question of deaths in a manner in which they can, because we see that they deal with the question of births in that manner. And one has to inquire, why is it that births are dealt with in that manner and deaths are not dealt with in that manner? So that we do not have a system that provides for the same level of scrutiny of deaths as the system purportedly provides for the level of determination of births.
Is this a deliberately prepared recipe for rigging?
Well, I would think that the birth part, which is recent, is definitely a recipe to facilitate the registration of births of people who are not necessarily born in Guyana, who may have come from across the border, and you get some Tushau to say, yes, this person was born here. And mark you, the system provides for somebody who might be 80 years old to get the Tushau to say, yes, I am 91 and I know him from this village.
It also allows a 30-year-old to sign an affidavit for a 90-year-old person saying that
so
he or she
that
was born
system
here.
obviously is a flawed system, but I don't think it's flawed by accident. I think it's flawed by intent. And so we have a skewed system that seeks to look after the interests of those who are responsible for making the laws, as opposed to those who are on the other side. So yes, the first provision there works in as much as it can, but cannot be a standalone provision, given the number of Guyanese who die overseas, and given the fact that deaths are not all registered. And we do not have a complementary mechanism in the objections process, which allows for the instance where there's the absence of a death certificate for an affidavit. We have had instances where relatives have gone to say, yes, this person has died, and it's not accepted.
We've had instances where people have produced photographic evidence having attended funerals.
All of that.
And GECOM's position
All of that.
is that no death certificate, no action.
All of that.
Mr. Alexander, Prior to the elections of 2020, there was a hue and a cry from the People's Progressive Party demanding a clean voters list, demanding biometrics to be used in the electoral process. In or around 2017 or 18, the coalition government had voted financial resources to GECOM's budget to facilitate what many refer to as the cleansing of the voters list by house-to-house registration. We know where that ended. Many people have been saying, oh, you were in government, what did you do about it? But of course, the executive is separate and apart from the judiciary. The executive funded an exercise which the judiciary brought to an end. Is biometrics a middle ground for solving this problem associated with this bloated list, this official list of electors, which is bloated by more than 200,000 names?
As I have said earlier, one of the problems is that you have people who were not in the country for whom votes were cast. When we talk about biometrics, what are we talking about? We're talking about, first of all, a system that allows for the captured fingerprints during registration digitally. That's the first aspect of biometrics. That is an important measure for us to embark upon. Why? We do cross-checking of fingerprints to make sure there are no duplicates. In other words, that one person doesn't register more than once. In every instance, we do come up with instances where there are duplicates. But one of the revelations of this process is that because we do manual capture fingerprints, and the manual capture fingerprints have imperfections, that the cross-matching is unable to cross-match all of our fingerprints because of the imperfection of some of those prints.
Right.
So the present system allows for instances where there are fingerprints that cannot be verified. And so you may have instances of duplicates going through. So that's the first instance. And this is not conjecture. We have experienced the instances, particularly in that same period of the 2019 period, where there were large numbers, significant numbers of fingerprints that could not be verified because of the imperfect manual fingerprinting. To perfect the fingerprinting, they should be taken digitally. If you take the fingerprints digitally, you are assured of almost 100% perfect because the digital mechanism rejects a bad fingerprint. It's like going to the immigration in America. If you don't place your fingers properly, the machine rejects it until you place your fingers properly. So that it's in GECOM's interest, if it's going to get the kind of list where they can cross-match all of the fingerprints, to introduce digital fingerprinting. Some attempts were made at that in the past, and the process was stymied by a 4-3 vote in the commission. Stymied. We are about to discuss this matter again. Getting there slowly, but about to discuss it again. So that's the first aspect of biometrics. The second aspect of biometrics is that if you have captured all of your fingerprints digitally, then there's a possibility that at the place of poll, you can use a system similar to what the Americans use, or the Venezuelans use, or all over the world uses, to check the veracity of the person presenting himself or herself by ensuring that the fingerprints of the person, the live fingerprints, correspond with what's in your database. And therefore, in that way, even if you have a bloated list, the mechanisms in place will not allow for persons who are not physically present to cast their vote. So the answer to your question is yes. Biometrics can serve a purpose insofar as it can block unauthorized persons from for casting votes for authorized fingerprints in the system.
Following the announcement of the results of the 2020 elections, controversial as they were, you pointed out that the commission, the Guyana Elections Commission, refused to conduct that internal review of its processes. Simultaneously, the People's Progressive Party, through its General Secretary and other functionaries, and all other functionaries have backed away from the demand that they have been making for biometrics on the clean voters list. It is evident, therefore, that the People's Progressive Party is comfortable with a bloated list, comfortable with all of the openings that permit unauthorized persons to cast votes for persons not present and whose names appear on the list. Why would a political party that preaches democracy, that speaks to and embraces one person, one vote publicly, but obviously they don't embrace that internally, why would they refuse to have put in place checks and balances that allow for what they preach to become a reality?
Well, there could only be one reason for that, is if they are beneficiaries of the SART system. And let's go a little further to show the interest or the disinterest that they have in this matter. As I said earlier, the APNU AFC submitted thousands of names of persons who allegedly were voted for but were not in the country. That submission was made to GECOM. GECOM only submitted the first 3 or so of those lists, which would come up to somewhere in the vicinity of 800 persons. Verification was done. It was shown that of those lists, 75% were not in the country. GECOM retained a large number of submissions of the APNU AFC, which were not sent for verification. In 2022, here comes the Attorney General demanding that GECOM hands over all of those lists to the government so that the relevant authorities could verify what in fact occurred.
And that was the end of that matter.
But in arguing his case, he said to verify in fact that those lists were another attempt to perpetuate a wrong. That's how he approached this matter. He didn't say, he wasn't neutral in saying, let's see the list and see whether it's right, the contention is right or the contention is wrong. He pointedly said, let's get to those persons who did another wrong and we deal with them. That's what he said. And one can check the newspapers of August, I think, and July of 2022, and you can see him very verbose on this matter. GECOM handed over on a 4-3 vote all of the lists. 2022, I think it was August. Since then, this government, which took those lists to show wrongdoing on the part of the people who compiled the list, has been patently silent on this matter. Although they said that these lists will be taken and sent to the relevant authorities for verification. And the relevant authority here would be the chief immigration officer in the first instance,
Who is the commissioner of
who is the
police?
commissioner of police,
Mm.
under whose signature we received verification of the first set.
Mhm.
And they were sent for all intents and purposes. The lists were sent to the chief immigration officer, but there has been no response, no public response. I have personally, in fact, the Attorney General has said to me, why is it that I keep mentioning him as a person having these lists, that he doesn't have them, right? And in fact, in the last conversation said, well, the police might have them.
Can I interrupt you to ask you this here, Mr. Alexander? Persons have been charged criminally for alleged electoral malpractices, employees of the commission. The chief immigration officer is the commissioner of police. These lists, were they not potential evidential material in these ongoing cases? And if they were, sending them to the chief immigration officer, who is the commissioner of police, would that not be a disservice to the justice system in the case of these charges?
Two things. There are more evidential in the petition than in those charges, in my humble opinion. They're more relevant to the petition than to the charges. What is interesting about the charges is that those charges are for attempts. So people are being charged for attempts because at the end of the day, whatever they accuse those people for did not have the positive, negative impact on the system because of the recount. So people are being charged for attempts. But here you have evidence of that can prove things that have occurred, and no effort is being made to use that evidence. But people are charged for attempts. Given the fact that in the past, the chief elections officer was not charged for his attempt. In 2011, there was a clear attempt, a documented attempt by the chief elections officer to give a false declaration in the favor of the People's Progressive Party. All the evidence is there. He was never charged.
This is a stolen seat case.
No, this is an attempt to steal the seat. I'll come to the stolen seat case just now. A 2011 attempt to steal a seat. He wasn't charged. But the people who are before the court now are being charged for an attempt. But he wasn't charged for his attempt. And the impact of his attempt was absolutely no lesser in magnitude than what those people are being charged for. Absolutely no lesser. Because if they're using the figures in this one seat arrangement, the impact is no lesser. In fact, in his instance, it was a one seat attempt, and they're charged for a one seat attempt. But he wasn't charged.
And the one seat made a difference between government and opposition.
The one seat then made a difference and would now have made a difference.
Yeah.
But he also was not brought to board in 2006, not for an attempt, for an actual allocation of a seat to the People's Progressive Party in Linden, when all of the evidence was provided to him prior to the allocation to show that he had come to a wrong conclusion, whether intentionally or otherwise, in relation to the allocation of the seat in Linden that went to the then Prime Minister, Sam Hines. So we have a system where clearly the system is skewed towards those who operate the system to facilitate their wrongdoing, but to at the same time attempt to finger others for wrongdoing. And the 2020 situation is no different because no attempt is being made to determine the wrongdoing in terms of all of those names that were voted for. And those were impactful. So those weren't attempts, those have succeeded and are a part of the determination of who's in government. But people who are accused, who allegedly did wrongdoing, are being charged. And in a similar manner, the reform of the law did not seek to address the wrongdoings that are blatant and require redress.
And fail to make it mandatory for internal reviews to be conducted.
All of that. So we clearly have a situation where the powers that be are using their power to pursue their interests, an interest which is obviously on the side of wrong because of the evidence available to show what should be addressed, what is not being addressed, and the consequence of what is not being addressed. The latest case being corralling thousands of names of persons that can be verified as not being in the country and being absolutely silent, patently silent for 2 years, even as you have the bold face to continue to point the finger at people who are before the court as if they're guilty when the court is still to deal with the matter, when you have evidence that can be used to make a determination on the other side of the fence.
Well, it is apparent that the People's Progressive Party intends to rig the next regional and general elections. One, there's a bloated list. Over 200,000 names that reasonably ought not to be there are there. And the effect of that is that the list is only 28,240 names less than the last known population figure. Two, the People's Progressive Party is resisting calls to release the report of the most recent census, which many observers believe will add some more points to the argument on rigging. Three, the People's Progressive Party continues to hold to its new position, refusing to have a clean voters list, refusing to have biometrics as part of the electoral process. It is apparent that the stage is set to rig. And with the ongoing charges, criminal charges in the magistrates' court against employees of GECOM, observers believe that this is really a message to the current crop of employees of GECOM that if you don't toe the line, there could be consequences. What are the solutions outside of a new impartial chairman of the Elections Commission? Even the legislation, the new bit of legislation is unhelpful to this process, as you just pointed out. Outside of a new chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission, what solutions do you see?
First of all, let me say that this whole question of rigging should not be restricted to what happens on the day of poll.
Precisely.
Because there are other pieces of legislation which are in place, new pieces, that facilitates acts that can redound to the benefit of the ruling party. So, for example, the manner in which birth certificates are being issued, which birth certificate then allows someone to be registered, can redound to them mobilizing cross-border citizens to be registered and therefore to vote in their favor. The manner in which registration is being done is very similar, because no longer are we obligated to verify persons at the place of residence. Someone only has to have a valid
Address.
address.
That is a disaster, really.
And that person can be registered. So there are a lot of things that are happening outside of the DF pool that, in fact, can move the way in which rigging occurs, move it away from that which is blatant and which have been discerned, that is impersonation, to have persons who are not eligible by virtue of their real status included in our voters list and being allowed to vote by virtue of that. So the whole question of whether somebody who comes from Venezuela is really a Guyanese or Guyanese parentage and all of that, those are all issues now that are impacting our registration process, our voters list, and the whole manner in which birth certificates are being issued also would be impacted. So we have a very, very patently corrupt system of the administration of births, administration of deaths, which feed into our National Register of Registrants and lead to the production of a voters list, which is not only bloated, but a voters list which may now be very well corrupted. You see, the bloated list, we're talking about Guyanese who died, Guyanese overseas. But when you have people who aren't eligible by virtue of how they get birth certificates and things like that, we now have a corrupted, bloated voters list. Now, it is patently clear that one of the problems we have is GECOM. Because GECOM as a constitutional body could in fact take a number of steps to deal with this matter. But we have in GECOM a situation where there's a clear block of 4 persons voting and perpetuating the system in its present form. And so one of the big problems is how do we deal with GECOM itself? Bearing in mind that almost all of the observers over the last 3 elections have clearly said, among other things, that one of the areas to be addressed is the composition of GECOM. And so we see that the whole question of GECOM and constitutional reform, for me, becomes a critical issue. What do we do in terms of trying to get a GECOM that could be neutral and trying to get a GECOM that can be professional? Because what has happened in GECOM, not only do we have a 4-3 situation in the commission, but we have a situation where the 4 have done everything to put in place in the administration their candidates. I dare anyone to question the fact that both the CEO and the DCEO did not meet the requirements to be appointed, but this question of a 4-3 imposed them upon GECOM, and there must be a reason why a particular block of people would go that far, where a DCU has not reached the number of years required for experience for the job, which is mandatory, but is given the job. And similarly, the CEO did not meet the number of years required, but there was a concoction about him carrying out certain functions as being equivalent to meeting the number of years when he was DCEO. So we have a concocted appointments. And so clearly, not only is the commission clearly taken a particular path, but they have also set up the machinery for the administration to take a particular path. The entire GECOM needs rehaul.
So, in summary, you were saying to us that the list has to be cleaned. The middle ground to cleaning the list is perhaps biometrics, which can go a long way. And for there to be some form of assurance of free, fair, and transparent elections, GECOM needs to be restructured in addition to the steps taken to clean the list.
Definitely.
In the absence of this, can one conclude that the focus of the People's Progressive Party for maintaining the status quo is to rig the next general and regional elections?
One can come to the conclusion the system is stacked in their favor. Suffice to say that there are some other mechanisms which we have not mentioned. I have repeatedly talked about the overseas debt. I do feel that there are ways in which that could be dealt with as well. We are about to discuss the question of how do we take the debt off of the list, the methodology, and GECOM will be challenged to deal with the question of the overseas debt. And again, we will see what is the intent of both the administration of GECOM and the commission itself when that challenge is posed, because there are ways in which the overseas debt can be taken off of the list. And if they don't accept those mechanisms, clearly they're embracing a system where the list continues to be bloated, and it can only be to their advantage that they would continue to do that.
The release of the census figures, how important is that to the electoral process?
I think the census figures, what it does help us to understand the size of our population. And therefore, what it does, it points to the accuracy or inaccuracy of the voters list. Suffice to say that, in my humble opinion, the greater part of the problem is the overseas Guyanese who are on the list, and some who are by law on the list. And so we have to find some mechanism that allows us to have a list where people who are not in the country do not vote. So even as you address the question of the quote, which says all Guyanese should be able to vote, there should be a mechanism by which, probably following Regulation 40, the National Registration Act, that the names of the Guyanese who are not in the country are flagged. So we know that even if this list has so many persons, that of those numbers, or of that number, so many are not in the country. And so we can do a better, we can be more vigilant in election day in relation to those who are out of the country.
And better project the number of voters who may turn out.
Expected number of voters.
Now, we're rapidly running out of time on the program, and it appears that we're rapidly running out of time at GECOM as well. Do you see, if we were to go to elections at the constitutionally due deadline, that there is an adequate window of time to effect the changes that you have flagged, that you have raised, that you have been discussing at the level of the commission for the last 4 years?
I would say, given all of the interim measures that I have in mind, we do have time to implement the interim measures. They will not be the fix of the problem, but we can have some mechanisms that can be put in place between now and the elections. But those mechanisms are not the mechanisms required to change the system. They're just mechanisms that can help to curtail wrongdoing during voting.
There's a widespread view that the People's Progressive Party are likely to go to elections before the constitutionally due timeline, referred to as early elections. If that were to be the case, it means that it is likely that
the earlier the worse.
The earlier the worse.
The earlier the worse.
Because we're obviously going to go to elections with a list that says the possible school population is 28,000. How dangerous is that for us as a democracy?
Well, as a democracy, that would not provide the basis for free and fair elections. Simple.
In a word, rigging. Mr. Alexander, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here today on Nation Watch. Ladies and gentlemen, I did prime you for this conversation last Sunday when I provided you with the numbers. I trust that you now have a very clear understanding of what the possibilities are with respect to free and fair elections in Guyana versus rigged. elections coming up upon us. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, sir, for making available yourself and obviously giving us the benefit of your technical soundness at the level of the commission. And I wish you and the rest of the team all the luck that you may require to get Guyana to a place where it ought to go in terms of the election process.
The pleasure is mine.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today, September 22nd, 2024, as we move closer and closer to regional and general elections whenever they come. Until we meet again, God bless.